This episode of Pod Session is brought to you by TopNaturalHealth.com, your go-to source for nature-based supplements, skincare, and anti-aging products. Visit their site for special promo code pricing on all of the products mentioned in this episode. Now here's your hosts.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's the real deal, folks, Hurricane Milton, and it's churning its way toward Florida's west coast. We're going to unpack why this one's got everyone so on edge. We'll look at the biggest threats and, of course, what you need to know to stay safe. And to help us make sense of it all, we've got our expert here ready to break it down.
Ready to dive in?
Okay, so let's cut to the chase. Milton is projected to be a Category 3 when it makes landfall, and that is a big deal. It's currently a Category 1, sitting about 815 miles southwest of Tampa, moving east at a pretty steady pace. But, and this is the concerning part, this storm, it went from a tropical depression to a full-blown hurricane in less than 24 hours. That is incredibly fast.
It really is. I mean, to give you some perspective, most hurricanes, they take days to go through that kind of intensification.
Yeah.
But this rapid development with Milton, it's what makes it so hard to predict and honestly, so dangerous. It gives people less time to prepare for a much stronger storm than they might have initially thought they were dealing with.
And if that wasn't enough to worry about, it's not just any other hurricane season, is it? This comes just days after Hurricane Helene hit. So you've got communities still dealing with the aftermath, the cleanup from Helene, and now they're facing another potential hit.
And the location, well, that adds a whole other layer of concern.
Yeah.
Since 1850, only 2 storms coming from the Bay of Campeche have tracked towards Florida like this. We're talking statistically, this is a rare event.
2 storms back to back, one right after the other. It's like adding insult to injury. So what does this actually mean for the state in terms of, well, damage potential?
Well, when we're analyzing the risks, it's crucial to really understand the specific hazards a Category 3 hurricane like Milton brings to the table. Mm-hmm. And there are three key areas of concern here. We're talking storm surge, wind damage, and of course, heavy rainfall.
Okay, so let's unpack those a bit. First up, storm surge. It's a phrase we hear a lot with hurricanes, but what are we actually talking about here?
Essentially, imagine a powerful surge of seawater driven towards the coastline by the force of the hurricane's winds. And we're not just talking about a few inches of water here, but a surge potentially reaching several feet high, enough to inundate entire coastal areas. Now, what makes Milton particularly concerning is that many areas expected to be hit hardest by this surge are the same areas that Helene recently affected. So
areas that are already vulnerable from the last storm could be hit even harder this time around. And especially if they haven't had time to recover, to rebuild, that's extremely worrisome. What about the wind speeds we're expecting with Milton? Because Category 3, that packs a serious punch.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about sustained winds up to 120 miles per hour.
Yeah.
To put that in perspective, that's faster than most people drive on the highway. And it's enough force to turn something like a loose piece of plywood into a deadly projectile.
Okay, I'm starting to see why this has everyone so concerned. We've got the potential for major flooding with a storm surge and now incredibly dangerous winds. And we haven't even touched on the rainfall yet. What's the forecast looking like in that department?
Right now, projections show about 5 to 8 inches of rainfall, but some areas could see as much as a foot of rain in a very short period.
A foot of rain?
Yeah, to give you a visual, imagine someone dumping, a small swimming pool on each street corner. That's what a lot of areas are potentially facing.
Which means flash floods, drainage systems overwhelmed, rivers, canals overflowing. That's a recipe for widespread disruption, even in areas further inland. So we've got a rapidly intensifying hurricane on a rarely observed path, a state still reeling from a recent hit, and on top of that, the potential for a triple whammy. Wind, rain, and surge. This is shaping up to be a significant event. But this isn't just any hurricane, is it? There's something about Milton's timing and intensity that is particularly alarming, right?
You're right. This is where understanding the historical context becomes extremely important. There are some, well, let's just say, eerie similarities between Hurricane Milton and some of Florida's most destructive storms.
All right, let's delve into the history books then.
One that immediately comes to mind is Hurricane Michael back in 2018. Oh. It also went through this period of really rapid intensification over those warm Gulf waters. And we saw it transform from, relatively weak tropical storm into a monstrous Category 5 hurricane in just a matter of days. Mm-hmm. The impact on the Florida panhandle was, catastrophic, doesn't even begin to cover it.
Hurricane Michael, that's one for the history books. The images of the destruction, especially Mexico Beach, they're seared into my memory. Entire neighborhoods just gone. wiped off the map by that storm surge.
Exactly. And that's precisely why Milton's rapid intensification is such a cause for concern. It really echoes that unpredictable nature of Michael and that potential for a similar scenario. We can't ignore that.
So we've got one unnerving comparison there. What else stands out when you look back at past hurricanes, Stephen?
Hey guys, just a quick reminder that today's episode is brought to you by topnaturalhealth.com, home of the world's #1 top-rated nature-based supplements, skincare, and anti-aging products. Be sure to visit their site at topnaturalhealth.com for special promo code pricing for our listeners. Now, back to our show.
Well, let's shift our focus to Tampa Bay, because that's right in Milton's projected path. And the last time this region experienced a direct hit from a hurricane of this magnitude, well, you got to go all the way back to 1921.
Wow.
And that storm, it caused an 11-foot storm surge, which, if you recall, is very close to what's being projected for Milton. But, and here's where the comparison gets really concerning. Back in 1921, the population of Tampa Bay, well, it was minuscule compared to the sprawling metropolis it is today. We're talking about essentially the same level of storm surge, but with exponentially more people, more infrastructure in harm's way.
So potentially an unprecedented disaster for the Tampa Bay area. It's like what we heard before Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. Everyone knew a major hurricane was inevitable. But the reality of the impact, it was far worse than anyone could have imagined.
Exactly. And the fact that Florida just faced Hurricane Helene, that just adds a whole other dimension to this situation. 2 major hurricanes striking the same state within such a short time frame. I mean, that takes us back to the infamous 2004 hurricane season when four major hurricanes slammed into Florida in just 6 weeks. It's a stark reminder of how vulnerable Florida is during hurricane season and how quickly these conditions can escalate.
2004, that season overwhelmed emergency response systems, devastated communities, and the economic impact was, well, it was staggering. It sounds like we're potentially facing a perfect storm of risk factors with Milton.
We are. And while these historical comparisons, they highlight just how serious the situation could become, it's important to remember they don't predict the future. What we can do is learn from the past, understand these potential risks, and most importantly, take proactive steps to prepare.
Absolutely. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this information, but knowledge is power in these situations. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about what people in Florida, or really anyone in a hurricane-prone area, can do to prepare for this storm and for any potential impact. So much of what we've been talking about focuses on the immediate danger, the wind, the rain, the flooding, but as we saw with some of those historical examples, the impacts of a hurricane, well, they can linger long after the storm itself is gone, especially for the environment. I'm curious, what kind of lasting effects could a storm like Milton have on Florida's coastal ecosystems, especially, after just going through Helene so recently?
Yeah, you bring up an incredibly important point, and you're right. Hurricanes, they don't just impact human lives and our infrastructure. They can really deliver this powerful blow to the natural environment. And those effects, well, they can ripple outward for years, even decades. And the fact that we're looking at a potential double hit here, Helene and now Milton, it raises some serious concerns about that cumulative impact on these fragile ecosystems.
So when we talk about that long-term ecological impact, what are some of the biggest concerns? What should we be paying attention to in the coming weeks and months?
Well, think about this. Storm surge, as dangerous as it is because of the flooding, it can also push saltwater far inland, contaminating freshwater habitats. And that's incredibly harmful to any plants and animals that they aren't adapted to those saltier conditions.
So it's like they get hit with this 1-2 punch, these powerful winds, and then this rush of salt water inundating their homes.
Exactly. And then, of course, you've got the heavy rainfall, which, yes, it causes those immediate floods, but it also leads to this excessive runoff. And that runoff, well, it carries pollutants, everything from fertilizers and pesticides to debris and sewage into the rivers, the streams, the estuaries, and all of that harms water quality. Damages aquatic life.
It's easy to forget about those kind of hidden impacts in the immediate aftermath of a storm, but they can be just as devastating in the long run.
Absolutely. And let's not forget about the physical damage to the coastal habitats themselves. These vital ecosystems, things like coral reefs, seagrass beds, mangrove forests, they're all incredibly important. They provide shelter, they act as nurseries for marine life, they protect our coastlines from erosion, they even act as natural buffers against these storms. But they are incredibly vulnerable to the raw force of a hurricane.
Right, and then it becomes this vicious cycle. The more those ecosystems are degraded, the fewer natural defenses we have against future storms, which then, of course, just compounds the problem. It really drives home that interconnectedness of well, everything.
It really does.
Yeah.
And we haven't even touched on the long-term impacts on wildlife. Think about the birds that rely on those coastal habitats for nesting, for feeding, or sea turtles that come ashore to lay their eggs. Those nesting sites, they could be wiped out, completely destroyed, their food sources decimated. It's a stark reminder that hurricanes, they're not just weather events, they're ecological disruptors.
Yeah.
And they can have these far-reaching consequences.
You've definitely given us a lot to think about today. We've covered the immediate danger, the historical context, those practical steps people can take to prepare, and now these long-term environmental implications. It's a lot to process.
As we wrap up here, do you have any final words of wisdom for our listeners, many of whom are probably facing this storm head-on? Stay informed, stay prepared, and check in on your neighbors, especially those who might need an extra hand. And for anyone listening, even if you're not in Florida, remember that what happens here, it has this ripple effect. So pay attention, learn from this, and consider how you can be a part of building a more resilient future.
Those are wise words. Thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing your expertise and breaking down this complex situation.
It was my pleasure. And everyone listening, please stay safe.
And to all our listeners out there, you heard it here. Stay informed, stay safe, and we'll be back soon with another deep dive.
From all of us here at Pod Session, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and don't forget to visit our sponsor, topnaturalhealth.com, for special promo code pricing on all of the products mentioned in this episode. See you next time.